Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the new Pembroke Auditorium for our annual Jo Cox Lecture. Jo was a student here at Pembroke in the 1990s, studying HSPS, and devoted her life to fighting injustice and solving the problems of the world. She was tragically murdered in 2016, about a week before the Brexit referendum. And in her honour, we are proud to host each year this Jo Cox Lecture. I'm delighted that Brendan, Jo's husband, and Kulin and Layla, Jo's children, are able to be with us here this afternoon, and that Gordon and Jean Leadbeater, Jo's parents, are able to be here as well. This lecture was going to be introduced by Kim Leadbeater, Jo's sister, and now the MP for Spen Valley. Kim has a rather important bit of business in the House of Commons tomorrow morning, and as a result, although until this afternoon she was determined to come here to introduce the lecture and then to speed back to London, but as a result she has not been able to make it to Cambridge. She sends fulsome apologies. However, in order to introduce Louise Casey, our very distinguished speaker this afternoon, Gordon Leadbeater, Jo's father, is going to do the honours. Gordon, welcome.
It's very good news that you're all in the dark, because it means I can't see those of you that are going to drop off. And I also can't see those of you that are frowning with horror at some of the things that I might say. God willing, I won't, but you never know. First of all, I want to say just an enormous thanks to the Leadbeater family and the Cox family for both supporting this lecture, but more broadly the work that both Jo and Kim did and continue to do, and I feel an enormous honour actually, and therefore I'm incredibly nervous to speak this evening on the basis that it feels Well, it feels very timely about what's happening in the world, and it feels very important to essentially honour Jo's life and death on behalf of both Cullen and Leger, but everybody in the family and beyond, a wide family, a wide series of people and connections, to try and carve out a world that is slightly better than the world was yesterday. And in simple terms, I think that's what we all try and do in different ways, but certainly Jo Cox did do that, so thank you. It's also, I have to say, the first time that I've opened my mouth before the general election. I've been dormant and silent now for quite a long time, and it's also the first time I've talked about, agreed with Brendan and with Chris, that I talk about a Radio 4 series that I had the honour to do in January. I've never done anything like it before. I don't know, I didn't look too carefully at the feedback on the basis that people might think it was horrific. And I had a great time, so I didn't want people to say they thought it was terrible. But basically, they very kindly asked me if I'd get involved in a series that tried to look at difficult issues that people think can't often be solved. And it was called Fixing Britain. Very ambitious and very timely, I guess. And so we thought what I'd do this evening is basically base the lecture, the speech, the words essentially on that radio programme, and I'm going to structure it around that, in part because I haven't done a speech on this, nor indeed have I talked about Fixing Britain since we did the radio series. So I'm going to follow the order. And what I'm decided to do is, rather than bore for Britain on the 5 problems that I identified in the series, and they are homelessness, rough sleeping specifically, hunger, things like food banks, care, i.e. kids in care and kids leaving care, violence against women and girls as a very topical one, and you could call it integration or social cohesion. And they're 5 separate topics, but what connects them are 12 lessons, I think, for how government and therefore wider society can get things done and fix things. And so what I'm going to do, rather than tell you how terrible each of those 5 topics are, I'm going to just wander through, and I've been given no more than 30 minutes, and that's why I've got my phone out. And Chris, I expect you to, do a wind-up signal that I'll ignore. That's the great thing about it. You wouldn't. So I'm going to just wander through this. So forgive me, I'm slightly rusty. So look, the first thing that was so interesting is that during 2020, we all hit something called COVID and the pandemic. And what was very interesting about that time is that things that people always thought were impossible became possible. And I'm a great believer in using emergencies, crisis, and when politicians think they need to do something in quick time to one's advantage. But the first lesson, I would say, from the Fixing Britain series was, if there's an emergency, if everyone is clear on the end goal, everything that looks impossible becomes possible. And I think what was so interesting is, if you think about the rise in street homelessness in Cambridge, if you think about the rise not just in street homelessness, but the numbers of children now that are growing up in bedrooms that are, or rooms actually, that's their total living space is the size of a car parking space. That's the huge shift since I was the first homelessness czar back in the late 90s and early 2000s, is we didn't put families with children in spaces that big, in quite often, even in things like shipping containers with tiny little windows at the top. We just didn't. And so there's been a massive shift, I think, in what homelessness was. But what COVID did was prove that we could do something about it. And so over a period, it was extraordinary, really, that essentially over a period of 2 weeks, something like 14,000 people were pulled off the streets and out of night shelters, church halls like ones here in Cambridge, where there were 6,000 people sleeping in church halls and community centres on a night-by-night basis. There were 6,000 of those. There were at least 6,000 people sleeping on the streets. All of those people were brought in, and they were brought in using a really straightforward thing. Hotels were emptying. You couldn't have hotels, so we had empty hotels, including posh ones, and we had people on the streets, and we just moved people off the streets into those hotels. And the homeless charities and many people and organisations just couldn't believe that this was happening, it was doable. And it was an unrelenting, I mean, I can't remember a time I worked quite as hard, but that's a good thing, it was an honour, that essentially, and it went up to 26,000 people. And at one point I said to Robert Jenrick, in those days, seemed more progressive, let me put it that way, than perhaps his leadership campaign. I'm going back to being a civil servant. I mean, he actually seemed to have a heart, and actually seemed to think that getting people off the streets and into hotels was a good thing. And we got to it was like 12,000 in 9 days. And of course nobody was paying me to do this. I was just in there being really annoying and getting the job done. And there was a Teams call, and he looked down the thing, and I said to him, has anybody got you smelling salts? And I thought nobody in the room, I was showing my age, nobody else in the room knew what smelling salts were. And they said, well, why does he need those? And I said, because we've just spent a fortune, but people won't die. And then there was another moment in that period, which is fascinating. Remember, this is a Boris Johnson government at this stage, where actually I thought it was really interesting that they didn't, though, want to follow through. So it was fine getting everyone in, and I can stand before you today as part of a group of people that did that, and I'm very proud of it. Did I think it solved homelessness? No, it didn't. It was, which is my second lesson, that initiatives, no matter how big and bold they are, and they do good sometimes along the way, but initiatives rarely solve the actual problem. They drive action, they make people feel better, but they often don't get to the difficult stuff. And if I was to say the difference between the COVID everyone in, that people still champion and talk about, and I think it was okay for what it did, it stopped people dying, with actually the Rough Sleepers initiative, which was 1999 to 2003, and again, that wasn't perfect either, but the difference with that initiative is that it was a strategy, and it basically prevented people coming onto the streets in the first place. It put money into long-term vulnerable people who were on the streets, and it made sure that there was support and help to people once they moved off the streets. I went for the job, and I said it's like an overflowing bathtub. When you run into that bathroom, the first thing you do is you switch the taps off. You switch the taps off. The second thing you do is you mop up the difficult stuff that's spilled over, and the third thing you do is you make sure it doesn't happen again. And that really was the Rough Sleepers strategy. And I think what's interesting is that is a much more difficult thing to do, because actually initiatives, taking action, is sometimes a very feel-good factor, but does taking that action solve a problem? So I think when you're trying to fix things, and particularly when you're trying to fix them from government, you have to work out not what's popular, but what's the right thing to do that will get you the long-term sustainable change. I left that Rough Sleepers job. Somebody else and a team took over, and they brought the numbers of human beings sleeping out on the streets over the years down even further, and it stayed that way for a decade. So something was right about that strategy. It wasn't just a one-off, and I think that's the point I'm making. The other thing I wanted to say about fixing Britain is you have to do difficult, and it falls out of this as well. Doing difficult is actually sometimes being incredibly challenging. I was not the most popular government czar going because I relentlessly challenged agencies. I wasn't interested in the number of times that you spoke to a homeless person to get Section 43 money. I was interested in knowing when John, who'd been out on the streets 4 years in the same doorway, came off the streets and went into permanent accommodation with support. I was only interested in long-term results, and that doesn't make you popular. The same way I asked myself, no, I can't always sort out, what do we call them nowadays, adverse childhood experiences. So I can't necessarily do anything about the deep-rooted adverse experiences that kids have had, and then when they grow up, they're more likely to become homeless. But I might be able to stop them becoming homeless that night if I decided I was going to troubleshoot their landlord, so before they ended up on the streets and were evicted, somebody went in to give the landlord some money and to make sure that the landlord didn't evict them. It's a keeping people housed strategy rather than a homelessness strategy. And that then takes on an entire, as a colleague of mine calls it, the industrial homelessness complex, which grows and grows and grows as you have a problem of a particular thing. Now that sounds very tough, I realise it, but you know, it's Pembroke, it's an academic institution. If you can't talk about difficult things in these sorts of places, you can't talk about them anywhere. So the third lesson though, and I think this is quite interesting, is, and we debated it actually, the power of having a Prime Minister behind you. And I think this is quite pertinent. So yes, I've had Prime Ministers and others behind me, and as in supporting the work I've been doing, sometimes because they've ended up in enormous difficulty and somebody's phoned and said they've got themselves in hot water, will you sort this out? That's happened on more than one occasion. But actually, Prime Ministers can't get behind too many things. So people in Whitehall often refer to, nowadays, I'll come to it later, the troubled families approach, they come to the rough sleepers approach, and you think you can only do that advisedly on a few things. Whitehall and society can't have high-profile initiatives or drives or strategies too often. And I think having the Prime Minister behind you it obviously helped with some of the jobs that I've done. But again, you know, the other side of that is that, you know, I remember David Cameron standing outside what would have been under Labour, we'd have called it a family intervention project, and under the Tories we called it troubled families. That's the other little trick that's not in fixing Britain, but sometimes some of us have a little red coloured policy over here, and then something changes and a blue people arrive, and you get it down and you Tipp-Ex out the red and you put blue on it and you just change the language and stick it back in, which is a true story when it comes to the Troubled Families programme. Labour wouldn't like the expression troubled, it's too judgmental, of course. But the Tories liked the expression troubled. But the really interesting thing, David Cameron stood outside his project and he leant over me, he's much taller than me, with his umbrella and his, you know, whatever. And he said, Louise, you do have your detractors, don't you? And I said, I do indeed, Prime Minister, that's absolutely right. And he said, well, you've got me and you've got the Cabinet Secretary. And I thought to myself, thank God I've got you, because if you're telling me nobody else in your cabinet supports the work that we're doing, we're a little bit, you know, the show is not going to be that pretty. But it did tell me something. And the other thing, just as I'm on this, because I think it's topical, is the thing about Prime Ministers is they don't have many levers and powers. You know, the one thing they have is the ability to do a reshuffle. Apart from that, they have a lot of soft power and they have a lot of ability to get things done. Not really. Things have to be done in each government department by a Secretary of State, and then you have to work it so that they get those things done. But the other point, number 4, is, so we've done, if there's an emergency, everything that's impossible becomes possible. Initiatives don't solve problems. They may make people feel good, but they don't get you long-term sustainable change. The power of having people backing you if you're doing something very difficult. But then, incidentally, you need a Prime Minister that's prepared to do difficult things and have difficult conversations. And I'm at 5, and that's not, all of those 5 don't fall into that category. At all. Some of them don't like having difficult conversations with their colleagues at all, and that makes life difficult. And then, of course, whether you have a Prime Minister or not, the most important thing you therefore need is the importance of data and evidence. And again, those of you that have known me for a few years will know right at the beginning I'd walked out of shelter, and I thought, not walked out, I applied for the job, got the job, and loved shelter, loved working there. I got this job and I was like, if I have to put up with one more person going on to me about evidence, and there's a terrible moment where I think I might have said in a public forum, if one more person from number 10 talks to me about evidence-based policy making, I'm going to deck them. It's one of my special moments in my career that you know, I regret now. But anyway, I felt it. And actually, they were right and I was wrong. That actually the really important thing, particularly if you don't have a Prime Minister behind you, is more than anything you need the evidence and the data. And I think that's one of the things that people talk about evidence and data, but actually often it's not good enough and it's not real enough. And dare I say it, in the hallowed place that I'm standing in, academia can take too long. So, you know, if you're trying to actually get something done, then actually you need, in a way, evidence and real data in closer time than sometimes on offer. Studying problems is always much more interesting than doing anything about them for a lot of people. And sadly, you need to study them enough so you know what you can do about them for somebody like me, as opposed to studying them for studying them's sake. But if you think about it, Michael Heseltine I had one of those, it was the 80s, and I was the closest thing they had to an outreach worker that they thought they could talk to. And so I had one of those huge phones, like massive phones with like plastic at the front, and you press the thing. The only person that rang me was Michael Heseltine. They had issued me with this phone, so he would ring up and say, I have just driven down the Strand and I have counted 43 people. Tell me who they are, how long they've been there, and what's being done about them. And I realise that that might seem slightly crazy to you. On the other hand, it showed his desire to get to the bottom of getting something done, and it meant that you could have, he was directly connected, my next point, to the policy that we were trying to do. But on data and on evidence, the Troubled Families Programme evaluation cost over £3 million. And when it was first put in the public domain, it was contentious because the is it value for money, one of the only times in Whitehall this has been done, didn't prove beyond all reasonable doubt that it was the Troubled Families Programme that had got the change needed and the money saved, or whether it was just because the sun came out and people felt better that day, which is fine. What happened, though, was somebody said it had failed. And I was prepared to say it isn't proven yet. So I wasn't going to say it had shown everything was perfect, but I would have said, could you give it more time? The evaluation is really early days. Front page of the Times, I was told by Downing Street I couldn't do any media on it because by now we'd had a regime change. So remember, you have a regime change from one Prime Minister to another, things fall between the gaps. Blair to Brown, it's not just the Tories. Cameron, Theresa May, you know, these are good Prime Ministers, better days than we've had in more recent times. But even in those scenarios, things can drop between the cracks. So the reason I think that being connected, lesson 5, is don't forget the people. Don't forget the people. And I think, you know, one of the things that happens is the north-south divide. And we say that with such ease, but people don't really do anything about it. And so I think to myself, I was like, if you think that Doncaster's population, so universal credit, fantastic, right? We all want, you've got these multiple different benefits, all very complicated, a little bit here, a little bit there. In Duncan Smith vision, bring them all together into one benefit, call it universal credit, and also have work as being the thing that actually you push using universal credit. Fascinating. Couldn't disagree with the word of it. Didn't like some of the implementation, but couldn't disagree with the word of it. The bit that I fundamentally disagreed with and still disagree with, and I put it in the programme in January, is the 5-week wait. It's the 5-week wait. So if you were somebody in Whitehall that had been born into a family in Doncaster where your dad, more likely, or possibly mum, is working, they'll be on a weekly salary. 60% of the people, when they introduced universal credit in the Metropolitan Borough of Doncaster, were paid weekly. So one of those people loses the job that they're in. Remember, these are low-paid moving environments. They might work in retail, they might work in cleaning, they might work in a factory. You're telling me that that man or woman has to wait 5 weeks before universal credit kicks in. And if you understood, and the money that they made off that probably wasn't worth it if you think of the destitution that those 5 weeks causes in those families. If you look at homelessness presentations, just because I can, because it's my bread and butter, if you just go to one of the indicators, which would be homelessness, you'll see in the metropolitan town of Doncaster, homelessness presentations go up in those 5-week periods. And those presentations now mean I've got families with children, and then, hey presto, everybody argues, domestic violence goes up, etc., because people are living in that environment. The most short-sighted policy going when it comes to it. And what was interesting about it is that they knew that that was happening. So the really interesting thing, Fixing Britain, is that actually as they hurtled towards this major reform that they were all so happy about, the DWP, the Department of Work and Pensions, knew that this would be really, really difficult, but they didn't stop the implementation of it. In the same way they said to people they had to sign on with post offices, and the only way you could get your universal credit was to withdraw it in a post office in cash. Like, these are people I'm trying to stop drinking when they're homeless, and you're just going to give them all of their rent in cash. I mean, the implementation of it was so important. And meanwhile, the Treasury, of course, were happy days, we've won. And what was interesting about the programme in January is both sides admitted that on air very gently on a programme, that actually they both knew there were flaws in it, but both these departments pressed on. So lesson 6 is, if there's conflict between two government departments, two policies, you need to resolve it, otherwise the policy or one on both policies will fail. And obviously the universal credit is a perfect example of that. Well, I was going to flash forward to now, and this isn't particularly my area of expertise, but you kind of look at the current government's commitment to net zero here, and you look at the commitment to growth, and you think, okay guys, when are we resolving that? Because they're two big different industries with a small I, and they're both pressing on, and nobody is working out what that might look like. And it may look like it does now, but you ought to have at least a conversation about it. So they go from macro issues, I think, to micro issues, but the one about universal credit, I'm okay actually, aren't I? I'm all right for time. Amazing now, I'm on lesson 7 as well, I'm cantering through it. And isn't that as well, actually, more broadly, I think we find conflict and discussing it really hard. And actually, if we were better at that within society, better at talking about things in a non-personal way, i.e. this is what I think and what I believe, and this is what the data tells me, and over here somebody has a different view. If we were better at that, we actually would be better at policy making. But certainly in terms of fixing Britain, lesson 6 is, if there's conflict, resolve it. Because actually universal credit, it hasn't lifted people out of poverty in the way that it was designed. And that's not just about the amount of money that people get every week. That is part of it now. But a lot of it was definitely about the delivery of it. Our next programme was kids in young people in care, children and young people in care, but particularly as they got into the teenage years and were leaving care. And I think the reason I have gone from universal credit and the impact, because I'll come to it, about what was happening in food banks. So, sorry, just going back to that lesson. We all talk about the growth of food banks. I interviewed Blair, and I said to him, what do you think about food banks? And he said, I think they are our modern equivalent of when he was the Prime Minister and thought we couldn't have people destitute sleeping on the streets. And that if you thought, what was the equivalent of that at the end of 2023, 2024, it was the use of food banks. And I happen to agree, because I think it's symbolic of a society that's lost its way. And I think it's complicated, and I realise it's complicated, but when we say we need to end food banks, we need to end the need for food banks, and in part by driving people towards work. So I'm not a soft touch. I've organised food banks, I'm well involved with food banks, but my guiding principle would be the dignity of somebody being in work and being able to buy their own food and look after their own family without handouts. I just don't like handouts. I like a hand up, not a handout. That's not my, that's John Bird from the Big Issues expression, and he's right to use it. But what was interesting about the end of that programme is that we ended up in a food bank in Bradford where I met a young man he was on his third child from 3 different relationships, and the last one was in a little buggy. He doesn't have access to his eldest. He does have limited access to the middle one, and the little baby he has every Wednesday. And he brought this little baby in the pushchair to the Bradford East Food Bank. And interestingly, our current response to that young man was actually to get him on sickness benefit, so the amount of money in his pocket went up. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm here now. You know, I'm here now. This is where we are as a country. There's not much more we can do than that. But my God, what a flawed response to that young man and to the 3 children that he has brought into the world. And therefore, being connected to understanding that and empathizing, challenging is so important. And that's what took me. We've got some mystery people have arrived. Thank you very much for joining us. Sorry, I find my own jokes funny. That's how desperate I've got. I'm 60 next year. If I don't find my own jokes funny now, I never will. It's okay, lesson 7. If you're trying to solve really difficult things with humanity, it's okay to be personally involved. It's okay to be sometimes emotional. You can't let the emotion override the data and the evidence, but you can let it inform your empathy button. And I think in a lot of difficult situations and in politics, people are taught to lose that. They're taught to be afraid of it, not to connect to the people that actually the policy is, inverted commas, for. Wouldn't it be better if those of us that the policy was aimed at was making the policy rather than having it done to us? But there we are. And one of the examples in the programme that I want to mention today, because I feel it's quite Leadbeatery, is the keeping siblings together. So I went off to Scotland and I interviewed Nicola Sturgeon. I am no Scottish nationalist, let's just be absolutely clear. But I was quite struck by Nicola Sturgeon and why she had decided on a purely personal level to actually make the lives of kids at the end of their lived-in care period and into independent living so important. And she says it in the programme, and she said it in interviews, in part it's because it's personal. She can't have kids herself, and therefore she wants to be a better corporate parent to other kids. And she got enormous criticism for this at the time, and I thought it was very interesting because I watched her do a speech and her voice wobbled when care leavers in the audience spontaneously stood up. They weren't organised to do this, and they applauded her and cheered her because she was talking about keeping siblings together, which people may or may not know this, and it beggars belief, but we split brothers and sisters up. We do it all the time. We think it's too difficult, we can't house them all together, we'll split them. Don't tell me that you need to split them. The total population in England still is around 66 to 68,000 kids. That's doable. We did 500,000 people in the Troubled Families programme each year. So 66,000 young people I don't bat an eyelid at those sorts of numbers, and nobody who is in a proper government position should either. But we split brothers and sisters up. And it is a cry from those young people, a cry of pain that this continues to happen on a regular basis. And Nicola Sturgeon tried to do something about that. But what was interesting about it is that she got so much flack for it. But what is interesting about it is in Scotland, they got closer to keeping siblings together than we have done in any other country in the United Kingdom. And that leads me on to some challenges require deep intergenerational change that needs to extend beyond the life of politicians and leaders. And this is where it gets particularly difficult, particularly for somebody like me. She talked about the pressures that ministers were under, looking for things that can be achieved early. Those of you that have worked in this environment know the expressions low-hanging fruit is very popular. You probably might try and do something about rough sleepers right now, whereas actually we should probably do something about those you don't see, which is tiny little children growing up there. If I was going to make a priority, I'd go to the children. Not popular, not as visible, not as public. If you were looking at demand and need, you'd go with those kids. You wouldn't go with, you know, a 58-year-old woman like me sleeping out on the street. Sorry. If I could do both, I'd do both. But I had to choose one, I'd go with the children. And in order to get something done, I think that it's really hard to do cross-party. And it's harder now than I think it's ever been, particularly after the last election, interestingly. It's harder to get consensus. And if you're trying to solve domestic violence, if you're trying to solve long-term unemployment, if you're trying to solve poverty, if you're trying to, you know, the Troubled Families programme, I put money on the fact it would be closed at some point. It is the one programme that reduces families, their children going into care, and in a safe way, the kids do well. It's not a short-term fix, but it involves long-term commitment. And actually, politics finds that really hard. But if you're going to fix Britain, you've got to do the intergenerational, and you've got to have politics that go along. So let's take social care, little cause close to my heart at the moment. It's facing us all down, and in fact, it's partly part of the debate around tomorrow, is that we are an ageing population, and we're also a population that able to stay very poorly, but stay alive much longer than we used to. Bit topical, I realise, but instead of considering that in a long-term way, we literally have stuck our heads in the sand about palliative care, about hospices, about how we get old, about the fact that social care until you're my age and you're trying to help families that have got parents in their 80s, you don't realise how terrible it is until you get there. Does any government, they've done 4 different social royal commissions on this, there's reports coming in and out of their ear rolls, but no political party. Theresa May had a little shot at it about costs for social care, and look what that did to her in her manifesto. So I think one of the challenges about fixing Britain is it feels that sort of the Westminster bubble and the sort of good folk saying we must have cross-party consensus. And I look at the parties and think you're not going to get cross-party consensus, which is why I think the country is more important. And on something like social care, people should be talking directly to the public about it, and in a way bypassing for a little bit, perhaps the people that are in SW1. Lesson 9, I'm coming towards the end, is passing a law is the start and not the end of fixing a problem. I don't think Matthew Taylor reminded me saying this, but Matthew Taylor, who used to be I think he was head of policy in Downing Street under Blair, used to say, it was a great line actually, he said, you know, sorry Chris, this is all a bit brutal tonight, isn't it? But I'm sure you can cope. That basically politicians, particularly if they're men, are like blokes with hammers. So he can say this, because I'm not saying it, so there's nothing sexist or gendered about what I'm saying. It's all, I'm just quoting a bloke. And basically he said that they're like men with hammers with nails. One nail is let's just put law through Parliament, Tony Blair. And the other nail, which is true, was Gordon Brown. This is all about fiscal changes. So Tony wanted to get more and more antisocial behaviour orders. He loved orders. He loves law. Stick law through Parliament. And I was like, I don't need any more bloody orders to sort out crime and antisocial behaviour. I've got enough orders. What I need to do is think about how we deal with issues like what's causing it, including poverty. And then over the road, when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, he wanted to do tax credits. And at some level, I'll take tax credits as being a good thing to actually get some extra money when people are working to keep them up and about. But as I said to Gordon, the problem is, Prime Minister, some of the people in my families, the fellas can drink that tax credit away and it will never get near the family and the children. So if you just rely on fiscal change or you just rely on laws, you don't necessarily get what you need in terms of societal change. But there is a real issue, I think, that, I mean, let's look at I can't help this, but I'm so fuming with the last administration that on, let's take homelessness, it was a really popular thing to extend the Homelessness Act, right? and to say crisis loved it, everybody in the charity sector and campaigning sector loved it, which is essentially everybody can present at a local authority as homeless, whether they're a single 25-year-old able-bodied bloke or whether they're a woman with 3 children and one of them is disabled. It's like a level playing field. Everybody thought, great, we'll widen the duty with absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for the delivery behind that duty. So as a government, they took the amount of money going to local government down and down and down, at the same time that they did popular things like extend rights. And let's take SEND, special educational needs. They said to everybody, you can have your choice of where your child goes to. At the same time, a good thing, you know, parents with special educational needs kids, of course that's a good thing, but with no concept of how they would meet that demand financially. And if you just look at the taxi bills in local authorities trying to support that, it's eye-watering. And therefore, I think legislation, the same way tomorrow, God willing, that will be passed in some way, it's the beginning of trying to get that right, not the end. It's a symbolic, important, profound moment that will take its passage, but how you then get it done is as important. Okay, last couple of lessons. The importance of accountability. I did this in the Violence Against Women and Girls programme. I would prefer to call it Violence Against Women and Children, just on the basis that I think there are lots of boy children that also have quite a horrific experience of living in a domestic violence household, and I feel we're slightly missing them out. But anyway, that's for another day. But the importance of accountability was so interesting that on the one hand, you can say as a government, well, actually, this is all about wider society. This is all about men. It's all about Andrew Tate. It's all about social media. Yet, if you look at the news, and sadly Anna, Brenda's wife, can't be with us this evening, a woman that set up, because it's a small baby, but set up killing women, look at last week. Another woman put in a boot of a car, 24 years of age and driven 100 miles, by a man that we knew, who has now gone abroad, and she had been in touch with getting support and help. I'm probably prejudging IOPCs and lots of things, but all of that is in the public domain in newspapers, so I don't think I'm breaking any rules. And so you can be over here saying it's all really difficult, and that's right, you do need to look at those big issues, but you have to, if you have a target called halving violence against women and girls, you have to have a much more specific delivery where the police and the criminal justice system are the arm of law that gets that right. And we see too much failed delivery because it's too easy for people to point elsewhere. It's just too easy to go, it's not my problem, it's the fact that, you know, Louise Haigh has to do something about public transport for women. No. You need to make sure that if a woman puts a flare up that something is happening in her family, you take it seriously and you don't walk away from it. And so I think accountability is something which is one of the most profound lessons for fixing Britain. And if you look at what they might be doing on the missions, I'd be asking in every single one of those, who's got the red dot on the forehead? Which part of the sector has got the responsibility for the delivery of that? Because I knew when I was doing it, what I was responsible for and what I wasn't responsible for. Lesson 11, and literally on the home straight, which again is very dear to Brendan and myself's heart, is the whole issue of integration and social cohesion. And the lesson, I'll talk a little bit about the issue in a minute, but is ministerial and official churn. The more difficult the issue, the more important it is if you have a highly competent minister and you have highly good officials, is that you keep them there. We've had 17 housing ministers during the Tory rule. 17. That's just bonkers. I think it's 17 in 13 years. And we had for a moment a guy called Sajid Javid that seemed to have a bit of an understanding and a grip on this issue of integration and social cohesion. And because he was quite good, he was promoted to the Chancellor. And he went and became the Chancellor. I mean, didn't last long there, but, you know. But what's interesting about it, I think, is it's such a challenging issue because it means so many different things to so many different people. It's all the more reason to have a single minister that knows what they're doing and to leave them there. And I think the constant churn in Whitehall, most civil servants do 2 years in a role, not good enough. If it's 2 years because you've got a job done at the end of it and you're moving on, fine. If somebody else is taking over the job, not good enough. You have to take responsibility for your policy area and see things through, and I feel the same about ministers. And then the last one is I've got young people in the audience, but I think the two young people in the audience have heard me say this word before. It's JFDI, which stands for Just F Do It. And it's a really interesting thing. I'm a bit obsessed with Michael Heseltine. When he was he's probably not obsessed with me, but anyway, quite the opposite, I feel. I think they see me as a right pain in the arse, a lot of these people, actually. But anyway, well, sod it. Anyway, he used to get long, they're called submissions, so the sort of notes that are written that basically you give to a minister. Of course, they're called going up. Because they're more important, so you send them up. So you send a submission up. You're submissive and you send up this advice. And then God, who is the minister, makes the decision on what he normally, come back to Pembroke in 40 years in a minute, he then makes his decisions. And I think what's interesting about it is indecision is one of the worst traits in politics. I'd rather Blair said publicly that as Prime Minister, he knew he was making decisions based on 80% of the information with a 20% gap, but it was better to do that than not make a decision at all. And I think that's a really, really important lesson. And I have worked for different Prime Ministers, different Secretaries of State, different ministers, some of whom sit on things, and because it's difficult, they'll ask for more and more and more information. And meanwhile, another 5 years of a child's life means another 5 years of a child life living in poverty. Or, the list is endless. And it is better to just get on with things sometimes rather than overthink it. And in a way, I feel that's the right ending both of Fixing Britain series, is because I say, and maybe that's a lesson for all of us, that sometimes we should just get on with things and try to do the right thing. So look, just in general, be kind a bit about people in politics. Most of them wake up every day and came into politics in the first place. They make choices every single day, and most of them just try to do the right thing. It may not look it and feel like it, but most of them do. I'm speaking particularly of people in the House of Commons. Politicians often avoid the difficult choices because they don't want to deal with failure. Because if they fail, they're scapegoated, and then the rest of their careers are pretty rough. So if we can't accept that I'm very clear, I've got some things right, I've got some things wrong. If I had my time over again on the Rough Sleepers initiative, which is seen as a highly successful initiative, I know we could have done it better. And that's what getting older in hindsight has given me. But actually, I think that we're not very good at that. And that then means that for some of the big issues facing this country, which would be at least rough sleeping, hunger, kids that are vulnerable, violence against women and children, and the issue of integration and social cohesion, you can't get to those issues unless you're able to gift people the chance to talk about difficult things and talk about choices. And then finally, and I think it's partly really in respect of Jo, that I do think we need a wider conversation about what type of country we want to live in. And do we understand the challenges that are facing each other? We might understand the challenges facing ourselves, but we may not understand the challenges of people in other bits of the country, in other lines of work, and in other bits. Othering people, as the kids call it nowadays, this sense that it's happening over there and doesn't have anything to me. I think it's one of the empathy and understanding each other is the gift of a kinder and better society. And in a way, that's why I think the Jo Cox Lecture every year is so important and why it's been an absolute honour to be here today. But I will end on the fact that, do I think a lot of the things that people think are impossible are possible? Yes, I do. And do I think you can fix them for the long term and not the short? Yes, I do. And having spent 40 years working in the public sector, I know that we as a public sector could deliver on that. So thank you very much for having me. Bit long.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. Some really thoughtful insights there. And I'm now going to put JFDI above my desk to remind me permanently. But
I'll be having a drink now, Chris. I'm allowed to drink now.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. And to give a final word of thanks, Brendan Cox, Jo's husband, to say a word.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for braving the cold and sitting in it slightly. Just three very quick thank yous. I was first going to thank Kim, but Kim's not here, so I'm not going to thank Kim. But just to put on record, I think, how proud Jo would be of Kim, particularly at the moment. There's two ways of doing politics, aren't there? There's the sort of easy way where you try and get lots of friends, you climb the greasy pole, and the other way is that you take risks and you do things that you believe in, and she's doing that. Whatever you think about the detail of the bill, I think we're all very, very proud of Kim today. Second thank you is to Louise, both for tonight, which I hope there is somebody from Keir's office at the back making notes. If not, we should definitely email them the highlights. Thank you for that, but also thank you much more broadly for your example. But you were always one of Jo's role models because you have this sort of weird mixture of outspokenness, as we've heard, a sort of a fury, a sort of emotional drive, a passion to get things done, and an ability to do that incredibly effectively across party. There are very few Louise Caseys, and Jo was inspired by you, and she would be incredibly proud that you were giving this lecture tonight. So thank you. And then thirdly and lastly to Chris. Jo first met Chris with Coolin, actually. We're in Tuscany or somewhere very bourgeois sounding, much warmer than this. In fact, it was very hot, and we had Coolin in a champagne bucket trying to cool him down because he was only one at the time. And Jo and I were talking to Chris on the bus, and we weren't very excited that he was a former cabinet minister, but we were incredibly excited that he had climbed all of the Scottish mountains, all of the Munros, all 282 of them. So we had a very long conversation with him about this. Jo went on to climb 98 of those. Coolin, Layla, how many are you guys on? How many? 32? 20-something. So that inspiration has maintained. But what I didn't realise is that this will be your last Jo Cox Foundation lecture, because Chris is moving on. Have you announced this? I haven't announced it for you, have I? Yeah, okay, for you. It's okay. So I wanted to say as well, thank you, Chris, from all of our family for everything that you've done to keep Jo's name alive, to keep her as being part of the legacy of this college as well. And also, I'm being very nice to you because Coolin, Layla and I are going to come to your house in Scotland to climb some mountains. So thank you, Chris, as well.